Hi there, students. Archetype or stereotype? Archetypal, adjective, stereotypical. Notice the difference in pronunciation with the adjectives. Okay, an archetype is a perfect example of something, or the original model after which all other examples or things like that were made. A stereotype is the conventional image that people have of something in their mind. So, what's the stereotype of a Brit? Well, he's got a bowler hat and a pinstripe suit and an umbrella, and he's on the train going to work in London. What's the archetypal Englishman? Maybe someone with blue eyes and quite fair skin and light-coloured hair, not dark-coloured hair. Okay, so one is a real example of something, the archetype. Whereas the stereotype is the mental image of it. It's how people imagine it. Yeah? It's a stereotype is a formula that is generally held to describe a group of things. Okay? So, with the archetype goes in two ways. So, he's the archetypal Englishman. He's the perfect example of an Englishman. But the archetype of a machine is the original model. You can use archetype in manuscripts, and the archetype is the original manuscript from which all other copies come. In the old days, a long time ago, books were incredibly expensive. They were written by hand. And the archetype was the first example of it by probably the person who wrote it. And then that book was copied by other people. But this first example is the archetype. So, a stereotype is how people see you. Whereas an archetype is how you really are typically, the quintessence of you. So, what's the stereotype of a footballer? Well, he's someone with lots of money who goes to lots of parties and has beautiful girls on his arm. What's the archetype of a footballer? Somebody who's very athletic, very agile, very skillful with balls, has very good hand-eye coordination. But this is very different from the stereotype. What is the stereotype of a dictator? Well, he's a short little man with a small moustache who shouts a lot. What's the archetype of a dictator? Someone who's very cunning and very ruthless and has a very strong desire to be number one. What's the stereotype of a scientist? Well, maybe he has a white coat and glasses and pens here, and doesn't really live in the real world. Whereas maybe the archetype of a scientist is somebody who's good at numbers, good at thinking about theoretical things. The stereotype of a caveman. Well, a man with loads of hair and a big club, and he goes, and he's a bit stupid. Whereas I think the archetype of a caveman is probably somebody who doesn't always get enough to eat, who's very resistant to cold, who's been injured various times, and eats when he can get it. So notice the stereotype and the archetype are very different things. Notice a stereotype as well can be a metal printing plate to print things with, but that's another meaning. So what about the origin of these two words? Well, archetype comes from Greek arche, original, and type, tupos, a model of something, the stamp of something. Whereas stereotype, stereo is the Greek for solid, and typos, the model or the stamp again. So what about the formality of these two words? Well, I'm certain that stereotype is much less formal than archetype. I think stereotype I would give a 5 out of 10 in formality. You could use it in a conversation in the pub. You can use it also in a very formal document. So it's nice and flexible. However, archetype I think is probably something like 6.5 in formality. I guess you could use it in a casual conversation in the pub, but I think you might use either typical example or original example. I think archetype is a better word for something semi-formal or something very formal. So the stereotype, the mental image everybody has of a thing or a group of things. Whereas the archetype is either a perfect example of it or the original model from which all others were made. Okay? So, archetype, stereotype. And notice, archetype, the CH goes to K. So enough. If you enjoyed the video, give it a rating, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now. Archetype and stereotype.